We will talk about the supply and demand curve shift. In the previous lectures, we talked about what happens if a supply curve shifts and what happens if a demand curve shifts. Now, in this lecture, we're actually going to talk about what if both the curves actually shift, and what are the different possible directions that the shift may take place, and what are the outcome of such shifts. So it will the expectation is that it will give us a clarity of what happens if there are multiple forces operating on the supply and the demand curve. So let me actually draw the simple, let me actually write down what are the possible shifts that we can have. Let's say first I write down the supply curve. So what happens, what are the possible changes that supply curve may see? So one thing could be like if let's say the input prices are actually decreasing, so what will happen, the supply curve will shift to right, okay? And when supply curve, let me use a different color, when the supply curve actually shifts to right, what will happen is that we will see that the supply has increased. So basically an increase in supply. Whereas if the supply curve shifts to left for reasons like, let's say the input price, okay, let's say the input price is increased or the labor cost is increased, so it will shift to left. And when it shifts left, so what will happen, supply will decrease, right? Now let's talk about the demand. So these are the only two possibilities that you can have. It can also remain static as it is, and it can essentially change with price, but we are talking about the market forces that is operating on the supply curve. What are the implications of that? Now let's talk about the demand curve. The demand curve, similar to the supply curve, can see two types of movement. One is that it can move to the right. So essentially, demand for certain thing has increased. Let's say popcorn market, or let's say Parle-G market, and let's say there is some research that popcorn is really good, and or the Parle-G biscuit is really good for health, and the demand will increase in these cases. Whereas for whatever reason, the demand can also decrease. Let's say the taste and preference has changed, the weather has changed, or there is a research saying that popcorn is bad or Parle-G biscuit is bad. So then the demand will shift to left. So these are the only two possible movement that the demand curve can make based on different uh, impetus that it can get. Now, the point here is that we understand what happens to the changes in these different variables and how the shift happens, but we want to see what happens when, let's say, multiple forces are operating. So basically when both the supply curve is changing together. So what happens to the price and quantity? Now, let us actually draw our good old supply and demand curve. So let's say we have this coordinate and we have our price here and we have our quantity here. Now let's say the green line is basically representing the initial supply and demand curve, right? Initial supply and demand curve. Now let's say, so we will actually look into these possibilities. So there are two possibilities for supply curve shift and there are two possibilities of demand curve shift. So they're all together 2 into 2 possibilities. So there are four possible shift, right? So four possible cases we can see. So we'll basically draw these four possible cases. So let's say first we will write down the case where the supply is increasing and the demand is also increasing. All right. So when the supply is increasing, so let's say the demand for Parle-G has increased, okay, and let's say people have suddenly, the research says that Parle-G biscuit is really good, and the demand has increased. So demand has shifted to right, and supply, let's say, for whatever changes, let's say input price change or whatever changes, the supply has also shifted to right, okay. Now, what will happen because of this shift? So let's actually draw the lines. Let me use some different color. Let's say I will use the red color, let's say. So what will happen, my demand curve will come here. I need to perhaps draw a straight line. And the supply curve moves to here, okay. Oops. The supply curve moves to here. So the equilibrium, so basically the equilibrium is shifting from this point to this point, okay. The equilibrium is shifting from that point to this point. So now if this is Q, let's say this is our Q1, okay, and we'll talk about the price and quantity change, what happens because of that. So let's take the second case. Let's take the second case where I have, let me actually draw it here itself. I have, let's say, both supply and demand is decreasing, okay. I have both the supply and demand is decreasing. So let's say, the input price is increased and people have found Parle-G biscuit is really bad. So let's say this is my previous framework. This is my supply and this is my demand. Now they have decreased. So what will happen? The movement is going to be, of course, supply is going to go left and demand is also going to go left. Okay. And the new pair of these lines are going to be, this is my new demand curve and this is going to be my new supply curve. Okay. And the equilibrium has shifted from there to here. All right. Equilibrium shifted from there to here. So this is previous Q and let's say this is my Q2. This is my Q2. Okay. So we'll talk about this P and Q, what happens for all the shifts. But before that, let me actually talk about two other cases where the movement of supply and demand curves are actually opposite. So let me draw this. So let's say this is my coordinate system here. And let's say I will use the same color convention to avoid any confusion. So let's say this is my supply curve, this is my demand curve, and let's say now in this case I have my supply going up but my demand is going down. Let's say the input price is really low, you get a lot of labors or the wheat or other things that is needed for making Parle-G biscuit has gone down. So supply has increased really and the demand has actually gone down. People have found some substitute or for any other reason people are finding that no, they don't want to have Parle-G biscuit anymore. So the demand curve has actually shifted to left and now the new pair of lines are going to be, this is going to be the new demand curve and this is going to be the new supply curve, all right. Now, so essentially what happened is that the equilibrium has moved from there to here, okay. So I have, so let's say there was a previous price P and I have a new price. Let's say I'll write it P3 because this is my third graph. I'm not talking anything about Q. We'll talk about P and Q for all these different graphs that we're drawing simultaneously. And now let's draw the last part of this graphs, the last possibility where I will have actually supply going down but demand going up. Okay. So supply going down and demand going up. Supply going down, demand going up, and following the same color convention, we have our old supply and demand curve, and my supply has gone down for whatever reason. Let's say the input price is really high. Government has sort of created a minimum wage provision, and people need to, the companies need to pay a lot of money to the laborers and so forth. So let's say the supply curve, if it is supply is going down, it is going to move to left, whereas the demand curve is going to move to right. Okay. Sorry, color convention. Use yellow here. So now my new pair of lines are going to be the supply curve is this. Oops. The supply curve is this. Whereas the demand curve is going to be this. Okay. So the demand curve is going to be this. Alright, so now it was my previous equilibrium point and I got a new equilibrium point. So my equilibrium point has moved from here to here. So I get a price which is like P4, whereas my previous price, equilibrium price was P. Okay, and of course there will be some changes in Q as well. Now let us look at all the four cases together to make sense what is happening. Okay, so let's look at the first two cases. Now I can here when the supply is increasing and demand is increasing, so I can make intuitive sense of it. So demand is increasing, supply is increasing. So I can say one thing for sure: the quantity is going to increase because market is playing in the same direction. There is no contradiction. So what will happen? The Q will increase, quantity will increase. So that means Q1 is definitely going to be bigger than Q. But what will happen to the price? What will happen to the price? That's very difficult to say from here because I don't know the quantum of shift for the supply curve and the quantum of shift for the demand curve, and the price actually depends on the quantum of shift, and that we'll talk about later. But essentially, it can make sense if the, let's say the demand curve is shifting little, whereas the supply curve is shifting a lot. the price will go down. But on the other hand, if the demand curve is shifting a lot and supply curve is shifting a little, the price will go up. So in this case, when we have not defined the quantum of shift, we will say the price is indeterminate. Price, we can't say from this. We can't say, okay? Whereas in this case, where we had, this is a case where we had both the supply and demand decreasing. So in this case, when the supply is decreasing, demand is decreasing, one thing for sure, we can say quantity is decreasing. So we can say Q2 is actually less than Q. Q2 is actually less than Q. But similar to the previous case, we can't say anything about the price because we don't know the quantum of shift for the supply curve and the demand curve. So we can't say anything about the price. We can't say anything about the price. What about the other two shifts? So when the supply and demand curve are actually shifting in the opposite direction, so what is happening is that, well, I can actually say things about price with conviction, because here what is happening is supply is increasing, but demand is decreasing. So what is happening as a resultant? So when there are a lot of things in the market, but we don't have so much of demand, so the price is going to go down. So P3 is definitely going to be less than P, right? But can't say about the new Q. Can't say anything about the Q or Q3, okay? The last case where I have my supply going down and demand going up. So when the demand is up, but I don't have enough supply, so what will happen is that my price is going to go up. That makes sense, right? There's a lot of demand, there's less supply, the price is going to go up. So P4 is going to be bigger than P, right? But in the same case here, so since we do not know the quantum of shift for the supply and demand curve, we cannot say anything concretely about the Q here. So can't say Q4, okay? So this is basically sort of an understanding of how the supply and demand curve, if they move together, how the resultant is going to be looking like. So in the next lecture, we are going to talk a little bit about this quantum part, the quantum of shift for the supply and demand curve. We sort of mentioned that, but we didn't explain in detail. So I'll talk about the quantum of shift of the supply and demand curve. And finally, we'll talk about how supply and demand curve can have an endogenous relationship, how supply can create its own demand, or how demand can create its own supply, and which is often a confusing concept among the economics students. Okay. So with this, we end this lecture here. Thank you.